Do you have the dreaded coolant fitting leak from the turbos on the Gen 135 EcoBoost? If so, stick around to find out everything you need to know about this issue. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Mason. I'm a Ford technician here at the dealership. I work on Fords every single day, unfortunately. I have a lot to do, as you can imagine. So what I want to talk about today is the turbo coolant fittings that leak. They're so notorious for leaking on the 2011 to 2016 F-150s that have the 3.5 liter EcoBoost. In 2017, they updated the fittings. It's not a quick connect fitting anymore. It's just a standard O-ring fitting that slides down into a hole with a bolt that holds it in. Those never leak, or if they do leak, I personally have never seen one. The ones that I see leak are just like the one here behind me that came in. They have coolant fittings leaking, usually on both sides. Sometimes it is just one side. How do you diagnose this issue? The easiest way to diagnose this problem is going to probably be from up underneath the truck. If you have an underbody shield on your truck, you're probably gonna have to remove it to see it unless you have a car lift at home. The easiest spot I've seen to find the coolant leak on these turbos is most of the time the oil will collect from either of the fittings on the turbo and it will leak directly down the turbo and onto the oil return pipe that feeds off into the engine. This oil return pipe is a crinkly looking pipe. It's chrome. This is where I usually see coolant accumulating and where I see it dripping onto the ground from. Now you should know that if it is one of the other fittings leaking, there's 4 fittings per turbo. There's 2 on the turbo, 1 on the back of the cylinder head, and there's 1 that goes into the engine block on each side of the engine. If it is leaking from the one in the cylinder head or the one in the engine block, you are probably not going to see that coolant accumulating on that pipe like I just said. You're going to see it more towards the AC compressor if you're on the passenger side, or if you're on the driver's side, it's going to be closer to where like the motor mount is. Both of them are close to the motor mount, but you can see the motor mount a lot better on the driver's side because it doesn't have that AC compressor there. If it's leaking from the one in the back of the cylinder head, which is almost kind of uncommon, I have not seen very many of them leak there. They usually leak from the 2 fittings on the turbo. It's all the way up on the top of the cylinder head on the back of the engine, so you're going to look around the bell housing. So getting at that angle is kind of hard. But what I will tell you is you can go right over the top of the intake with a mirror, and that will help a lot of the times. It's still kind of difficult to get at the right angle, but if you spend some time, you can probably get a mirror to where you can see that fitting and see if you have coolant leaking from it. Not every time are you probably going to see a visible wet spot on the fitting. Sometimes you might see what I call orange fuzzy stuff. If it has orange coolant, it has yellow coolant, it might be yellow fuzzy stuff, but it'll kind of accumulate almost like corrosion around the fitting. If you see anything like that on that fitting, it is leaking. These fittings can take months sometimes to leak enough coolant out that you will be able to notice it by the engine overheating or your cabin heater not working. The truck I have here behind me actually had, I think, around 110, 115,000. It came in with coolant fittings leaking. The guy kind of already knew that that was his issue, but he wanted us to verify it. It was the coolant fittings leaking. It was, however, only leaking on one side. So my question is, should you be replacing both sides of coolant fittings if only one is leaking? If you tear a hole in one of your shoes, are you going to go buy just one new shoe, or are you going to buy a pair? You're going to buy a pair every time. If one side is worn, the other side is worn just as bad. Even if it's not leaking yet, there's no reason that you should be spending all this money on this very, very costly repair if you're not repairing both sides. How hard of a job is this actually to do? Is this something that you could tackle at home? And the answer to that question is probably no. This is a very in-depth repair. You do not have to remove the cab to do this repair. Myself, however, I always remove the cab because I never just do the coolant fittings. I'm always doing a lot of other things at the same time, because usually by the point 150,000 miles hits, we not only have coolant fittings leaking, but we have broken exhaust manifold studs, we have vacuum pumps leaking, we have valve cover gasket, valve cover grommets leaking, we have maybe even phaser problems, front cover leaking. So my personal experience, every time I do this repair, I am pulling the cab myself. I'm very, very proficient at being able to get this cab off quick. So I can have the cab off one of these trucks usually in about an hour, back on maybe hour, maybe hour and a half if it's a slow day, if I can get left alone long enough to actually get that cab put back on. I very, very seriously recommend, if you have the availability, to lift that cab out of the way. It makes this job 1,000 times easier. And the main reason I say to lift the cab is because the cylinder head fitting, the one that I said is on the back of the cylinder head at the top, cannot be replaced without removing the coolant crossover piece, the plastic piece on the back that crosses coolant over from one head to the other. To remove this, you have to remove the intake. And then even once you get that intake out, it is still not an easy task to do. These fittings are in a very, very bad spot, and with the cab on, it can be very, very time consuming to get these fittings changed. Me personally, if one of the fittings is leaking, I'm gonna replace every single one of them, including the aggravating ones to get to on the back of the cylinder head. What all should you actually be replacing whenever you do this repair? Should you be replacing the lines? Should you be just replacing the fittings? What else is very common to tear up that you should be replacing? I replaced the lines with the fittings. There's only two lines per turbo, so you're talking about 4 extra parts that you're gonna have to buy, something less than $100. Why would you not go ahead and replace all of the lines and all the fittings at one time? Along with the coolant lines and coolant fittings, I personally always replace the oil line and especially the oil filter. I think they're less than like 50 bucks for the whole oil line. That comes with the supply tube and the return tube. Oil filter that is there for the oil supply tube feeding the turbocharger. I've made some videos talking about this as well. These are basically just little screens. They stick out on the outside of the block on each side. It's what your oil supply line actually feeds into. It slides in just like that. It has an O-ring inside of the fitting. They usually don't leak, but what I have seen is with the lack of maintenance over the years, these oil screens will clog up. And what's gonna happen when they clog up, as you can imagine, you're gonna have a turbo failure because you are starving that turbocharger of the oil that it needs to operate correctly. Placing coolant lines, coolant fittings, oil lines, the oil filter that goes inside of the block, that's pretty much it as far as the turbo. The number one thing I would tell you to be replacing while you have these turbos off is your exhaust manifolds. Made several videos on this particular issue. The back stud on the exhaust manifold will break. I promise you, before you hit 200,000 miles, it will break. Probably even before you hit 150. Most of them I'm seeing somewhere in the range between 100 and 200,000 miles is when these back bolts are breaking. The reason that these studs actually break over time is because they did not design the manifold with enough bolts to fully support the weight of the turbocharger on the back of that manifold. There's only one bolt on the back, and they really needed at least 2. They did not do this from the factory, but the engineers were nice enough to redesign this manifold for us. So now we have a new style manifold that we can replace the old one with. And after replacing with this new style manifold, I don't see issues out of this engine. If they never had spark plugs put in, I usually like to do a tune-up. The other couple of things are kind of, you know, preference. If yours is leaking, if it's not, I almost always replace the vacuum pump unless it's been recently replaced by you. I'm gonna replace that vacuum pump because I know even if it's barely leaking right now, they're gonna develop into a more severe leak down the road. That's a super common oil leak issue on the 3.5. Probably gonna be going and quoting you valve cover gaskets and valve cover grommets because these rubber gaskets, for some reason, I know all rubber is going to deteriorate over time, but these seem to, like, in the range of 150,000 miles, somewhere around there, they usually start deteriorating enough that they leak pretty good. And it's not enough of a leak that you're going to like see it visibly on the ground, you know, in your driveway, but it is enough of a leak that you're going to smell it because those valve covers are right above what? The exhaust manifold. So if they're right above the exhaust manifold, the oil's falling down on the manifold, and that's when you're gonna get that stinky, like rubber burning, oil burning smell. If your fittings are leaking on your 3.5, how much is that gonna cost to replace? If you're just doing the fittings, you know, you're just snatching the cab off, throwing the fittings on, maybe some manifolds, I would expect somewhere in the range of $2,500 to probably upwards of $5,000 or $6,000, depending on how much of those things you are replacing. So if you made it this far with me in the video, you now know everything that I know about the coolant fitting leak issue on the 3.5 EcoBoost. I hope this video really helped you. If you haven't already, please like this video. It is free and it is one of the best ways to support this channel. I appreciate you guys watching this video. I will catch y'all in the next one. Peace.